Hello, this is Adam from RPG Site, and I am here with Alex, and we're here to talk about Twilight Princess HD, which released on the Wii U about a week back. Alex, how you doing?
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good. I just read your review in preparation of this, but I have been playing also, so yeah.
Yeah, so when this came out, well, I guess I should say, to start things off, Twilight Princess I've always been pretty fond of. I don't know if this is just my perception of things, but I always felt like, compared to some of the other Zelda games, the 3D ones specifically, Twilight Princess seems to have some people who really, really like it and some people who really, really don't. And I've always fallen into the former camp. I've always felt that it just does a lot of things that I think just kind of I have an affinity towards, and how it structures things and how the dungeons are laid out and how the story is presented and things like that. So when they said they were coming out with an HD version for the Wii U, I was pretty excited to try it out to see if my memories would hold up. And as you read in my review, they did. I really enjoyed replaying it, and I kind of crammed it all into a weekend, the whole playthrough. What were your general thoughts of Twilight Princess when it came out way back when?
See, I had a lot of positive feelings about the game, but it was, I admit, wrapped up in the excitement of the Wii launch and the big deal that was motion control and all that sort of stuff. And that was also, for me, that was right when I was first getting into writing about games professionally. So I remember, for instance, the Wii launch was the first hardware launch where I was like legitimately at hardware launch events and stuff like that, which was a pretty special moment for me. So it's wrapped up in all those sorts of feelings. In hindsight, I guess my feelings were prior to this HD version were that it has some of the strongest dungeon design in the series, but there's a lot else outside of that which isn't quite up to that same standard, and I would say definitely not up to the standards of Wind Waker and Ocarina of Time, which are two of my overall favorite Zelda games. Like, my favorites are probably Link's Awakening, Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, and Link to the Past. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I should mention, I never played the Wii version of this game. I only played the GameCube version, which I don't even remember now, but it came out a little bit later, actually.
No,
I don't remember.
No, it was I don't know. I think here in Europe, I think it was the same day. But the weird thing is, I never played the GameCube one because I got a GameCube copy, and then I decided it would be a travesty to open it because I had this sealed copy of this game that was quite rare, and so I never touched the GameCube version. So that was one of the nice things.
Let me check on that right now. So the GameCube version in the US came out December 11th, 2006. The Wii version came out November 19th, 2006.
Okay.
So only about a month later.
And I think what might account for that is that the Wii came out here about a month later.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think it was US first, then Europe, then Japan, because it was like a weird reversed launch.
Right. And I know, like, even this game only came out in Japan on a week later, which, you know, in today's day is kind of weird.
Yeah.
Have a Japanese game out in Japan after Europe and the U.S. But I guess Zelda has always been a little bit of a bigger title in the English countries, oddly enough. But yeah, I guess I should say with the Zelda series, I most of the titles I like a lot. So whenever I say I like one more than another, it's really nitpicking in a sense, and maybe kind of exaggerating what I may like or dislike about certain titles. Like Wind Waker, for instance, I'm actually not that big a fan of in comparison.
Gasp.
Yeah. So, like, I would say I clearly would say Twilight Princess I enjoyed more, but I still think both titles are really just, they're very comfortable. It's kind of a word I like to use when you're playing them. They're just, you know, really, really fun to play through, really relaxing. And they're a little bit different from most RPGs that you're not worrying about, like, stats or levels or things like that. They're more that, like, action-adventure type genre.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's worth addressing in this video, as we tend to do on most Zelda content, I guess,
right,
is that it it isn't really, technically speaking, an RPG, but we tend to cover it because the sort of spirit of Zelda is very much in line with the rest of the RPG genre, and it's the kind of thing that I think it's fair to say that most RPG fans are into Zelda as well. And I guess this, looking at this HD version in a reviewy impression sort of way, breaks down two ways. How good is the game and how good is the HD conversion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess we were talking briefly before we started recording that I actually, when I went home for the holidays just a couple months ago, I actually played through a little bit of the Wind Waker HD because my younger brother got it and he was playing through it. And I actually remembered this from my time with it when it came out a couple of years ago, that the Wind Waker HD had a lot of frame rate issues, especially on the Great Sea, when you have a lot of those ships with when they're shooting their little cannons, and especially like the things like the big octos and events like that really started to that game chugged really poorly. Like I'm talking like probably 10 frames per second or less.
Yeah.
I think Twilight Princess, this version is a little bit better than that in that there aren't any dramatic dips in the frame rate like that, but it's still not perfect. And that's kind of true with a lot of these remade 3D Zelda games. I know Majora's Mask on 3DS had a couple of frame rate dips here and there, and so did Ocarina. But I still think it's pretty solid on that front. The one thing that really stood out to me, I actually really am a fan of the art style for Twilight Princess. It's hard for me to explain it. It's like it's realistic, at least more realistic than than Wind Waker, of course, or even Ocarina of Time. But it still remains like there's still enough of a fantasy type of aesthetic to it. But on the original version, there were a lot of muddy textures, especially in like character faces and things like that, and it was kind of ugly in places, where I think the HD version, just having that higher resolution, some redone textures on characters and certain models elsewhere, I think really helps that art style, shine a bit. And I compared it in my review to Wind Waker, Wind Waker, I think it looks a little bit different than it did on GameCube, where
absolutely, yeah.
And I mean, like, not necessarily. It kind of it. I don't want to say ruined because that's too strong a word, but it kind of took away a little bit of that cartoony art style, I think, that was on the GameCube version when it was converted to Wii U.
Well, I think, like, in my review, I don't remember exactly, but in my review of that game way back when, I think what I wrote was something to the effect of they've put in a realistic-looking art style. Not art style, a realistic lighting system, rather. But this more realistic lighting system is being applied to this completely unrealistic artistic style. And in having, realistic lighting on the cell shading, the toon shading, whatever you want to call it, it actually ruins some of the effects of that.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking that for this, when I'm talking about visually speaking, I don't think there's any questionable change that were made. I think everything visually speaking has been improved, whether it's resolution or textures that were added to certain places. So I think on that front, actually this up-conversion, I don't remember who did the Wind Waker version, which studio, but I know this was done by Tantalus. They're an Australian studio. They were responsible for Deus Ex, right? And Mass Effect, those Wii U ports. So they were the primary studio behind this, I believe. Okay, so I guess talking more about the game itself, I think it's pretty common sentiment that Twilight Princess, its main strengths are in its dungeon design, both aesthetically and in terms of variety. So you have like the fiery Goron mines, you have the aquatic lakebed temple, you have the goofy the Snow Peak ruins with the Yeti, and it's.
I think in terms of that Snow Peak dungeon is probably one of my favorite in the series. I think
I was just going to say Arbiter's Ground is probably my overall favorite in terms of its. I was saying aesthetically, is one of the strengths, but also just structurally how these dungeons are laid out and how they're mapped, especially in the back half of the game. Once you're kind of past the warm up stages, I think they just do a lot of things. Like the Arbiter's Ground specifically, there are a couple of rooms that are more like combat arenas. There's a good mix of puzzles using human Link's normal arsenal of items, and also kind of using the abilities of the Wolf Link. His the digging and the sensing and all that, and it's and that dungeon also I think has one of the most unique and impressive boss fights at the end, which I'll talk a little bit more about those later, I guess.
I think for my money, my only real criticisms of the game when it comes to its dungeon design and things like that is that I think Wolf Link is pretty boring to play as after a bit, because over the course of the game he doesn't really change.
Wolf Link only has like 2 separate attacks that are barely distinguishable in the first place, and then that's basically that, and then he has like a charge attack, and that's basically it.
Yeah, and that would be a criticism, and the other one would be I think the game sort of cops out towards the very end when it gives you what is essentially an upgraded version of a previous weapon as the weapon, as the item for that dungeon. You get the dual claw hook shots or claw shots or whatever you want to call them, and that I think for me underlines one of the problems I have with Twilight Princess in general, and Wind Waker has this problem as well a little bit compared to Ocarina of Time, where if you think about the hook shots, there is a second upgraded hook shot in Ocarina of Time, but it is an upgrade item that you get in a place that isn't a main dungeon, and actually you can finish the game without the long shot. I think you
can't
can remember.
In the original version. With Ocarina of Time, I'm so used to the Master Quest version now, and I'm pretty sure you can't in that version.
Yeah, that probably makes sense. But yeah, I mean, like it speaks volumes. I think that in Ocarina, because that's an upgrade, it just is an item off to the side, and in Twilight Princess, it is a core dungeon item. Which I guess you could say that, in fairness, I guess you could, before somebody says it in the comments, I guess you could say that about the Mirror Shield too. But it's something where whenever I get to that dungeon in Twilight Princess, I always think it's a bit of a cop-out.
I do think the dual claw shot does add some interesting puzzle and traversal element to that dungeon, which is City in the Sky. It kind of adds a level of verticality where you're not just looking, left and right, but you're trying to figure out how to navigate. I know there are a couple of rooms where you have to kind of figure out how to go up or down through these various mazes. That's probably the most maze-like dungeon in this game. So I think it does some cool things there, probably more so than the long shot does, which is just literally hit targets from farther away. But I do see where you're coming from.
So I'm not as far in. I'm about halfway into this, but you obviously, because you've reviewed it, you've finished it. So in terms of changes, what's different in this version in real terms? I know they rebalanced some of the more.
Early on, there aren't that many changes. Like I know with Wind Waker, the Triforce hunting was changed quite a bit, and it actually it kind of moved around a bunch of the collectible items, like different treasure charts and heart pieces were moved to kind of accommodate for that in different puzzles along the sea. Here, early on in the game, when you have to collect those tears of light, those were kind of always criticized as annoying, like fetch quests, so they slow down the pace. You have to search for these bugs while you're playing as the wolf, and it's not necessarily. They lowered the amount of those. They, instead of having to get like 16 of them, you only have to get 12 in each of those 3 areas. Now that doesn't change it really that much. You remove one, or two, but you're still having to like scour across the whole area to find all 12 of them. But there are a couple of other things they changed. I know one small thing that really confused people when the game first came out. Basically, right at the onset of the game, you have to catch a fish in the village. I know in the original game, for some unexplained reason, you had to catch 2 of them. And I know that kind of confused people because they'd catch a fish and nothing would happen, and then they kind of just left, and then they couldn't figure out what to do. So they had to go. They realized that you have to catch another one for some reason. So in this version, you only have to catch one. It's just a small thing. And then I don't know if anything else was really changed in terms of like the game pace.
I want to say I'm so frustrated, by the way, speaking of the opening segment, that they didn't do anything to that excruciatingly painful slow opening.
Yeah, I
don't know what they could have done.
This doesn't really bother me that much, but I certainly acknowledge it. It took me just slightly under 2 hours to get to the first dungeon, which compared to like Ocarina of Time, you're there in like 10 minutes. So
it's more that there's so much talking, and that's one of the aspects of this. One of the aspects of this game that has aged more poorly. It's like, regardless of what your opinion is on if Zelda should have it or not, no voice acting. These characters sort of, when they speak to you, they lock into one loop of 1 5-second animation over and over again until you press A.
And unfortunately, my memory isn't that clear, but I know like Skyward Sword, which came after this, of course, kind of just, if anything, it didn't improve on that at all. There's even more talking.
Well, I think Skyward Sword it goes both ways, because there is still that, and and a lot of the talking is still formatted like that, but it also has the best
it has better presentation in general. Yeah.
The best directed cutscenes in the series. Like at the start of that game, they have some lovely interactions between Link and Zelda that sort of, hinted a romantic relationship and that sort of stuff that just hasn't existed in any Zelda before. So that's just nice. But that game, we'll talk about that game another time, I guess.
So
but
do an HD version of that.
I wish they'd done a bit more. I do think it looks better. I think a lot of the texture replacements are a huge, huge improvement. I don't think this art style ages as well, even with all the texture replacements, than Wind Waker's does.
I agree. Wind Waker's is just so incredibly unique, and it's kind of funny in hindsight how that was first, received compared to now, how it's become like its own secondary art style to Zelda, mostly in the handheld space, but still shows up in Smash Brothers and all that.
Yeah, I think in a sense, you and I are fundamentally opposed to disagree on this game, in that I would definitely call it the worst of the 3D Zeldas, and I would say this is the best version of it, but it is still the worst of the 3D Zeldas, whereas I gather that you are a whole lot more fond of it than I am.
First of all, this isn't unique to me in any sense, but I kind of separate my thoughts of the 3D Zeldas compared to the 2D Zeldas, because the games are just, despite being the same series, are just so different in how they're structured, in the dungeons and the puzzles and things like that. But out of the 3D Zelda games, this would probably be my second favorite. I probably would put Majora's Mask ahead of it. It just can't compete with the tone and the style that brought to the table. But yeah, I'd probably put this second ahead of Ocarina and Wind Waker. Yep.
Wow, ahead of Ocarina. Well, that's fair. But so
but like I said earlier,
in terms of the quality,
I'm nicking it. I really enjoy all these games, but
yeah. So I want to ask you about the frame rate. So we mentioned earlier that the Wind Waker HD had some problems. I've seen some stuff in this, but you would say on the whole it's a lot better and it suffers a lot less.
I mean, I think the only time I noticed it was I know there's the one area of the Hyrule Field, the larger area where you have some of those goblins on the boars that right after you. That was the area where I noticed it most, and I think there might have been one of the boss in the Snow Peak ruins where it slowed down a little bit too. But otherwise, it seemed to be more stable than what I remember of Wind Waker. And like I said, I played that not too long ago with my younger brother, and I kind of remembered how choppy that got on the Great Sea at times. So I don't think it's not great, but I think it's doable.
Cool. And so you would say, though, I guess that you think this is the best version of the game at this point?
I think it definitely is. A couple of things. First of all, in terms of other changes, the only other things they added are kind of small collectible things. They added stamps, which really the only thing that does is, in the original game, there were lots of hidden caves and and other chests that really just resulted in rupees or bombs or just kind of small things. Where this time they just kind of replaced them with stamps. So they don't really do anything other than you can use them in Miiverse, but it's a little bit of a collector incentive, I guess. And then they added an item to help get the ghost souls, the Poe Lantern.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it only marginally helps. What you basically, you just pull the lantern out and it as Human Link, and it'll tell you if there's a Poe like in that area, like on that. I don't know if it's in that screen that you loaded or whatever, but it helps a little, I guess. But otherwise, that's it. Now, I want to talk about the one thing about this game that's always kind of annoyed me, and it's my one major criticism of the game. Mm-hmm. Most of the bosses in the dungeons are really, really, really lame. And they're almost, the wording I used in my review is, and probably I think is the best word to use, is they're almost kind of pathetic. I remember, like, for example, the Armagoma, which is the boss of the
Forest
Temple of Time.
Yes.
He's basically a giant tarantula, and it's imposing, and he looks cool, and he's kind of a callback to Ocarina of Time, of course.
Yeah.
But then you just like shoot a couple of arrows at him, and then you hit him with the Dominion Rod, and it's literally like impossible to miss. And you just do that like 3 times, and you're done in like 4 minutes, and that's just one example. I think the boss of City in the Sky is a fire-breathing dragon, and you use the dual boss shots to beat him, but it's just so kind of mundane. You basically just claw your way up and to defeat him. And it's not just those 2 bosses. It's just kind of a lot of the bosses are just kind of boring. And unfortunately,
when I think of the bosses in this game, I think that they look really cool. There's a lot of spectacle. Like my first 4 would be the City in the Sky one, where it looks awesome, or the one where you're on the spinning disc and you're going around.
Yeah,
looks really awesome, but actually there's no challenge to it whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, and it's unfortunately the hero mode, which is actually I should have mentioned that hero mode does, I think, help. I think it does improve the game even more early on. Zelda games were never really known for their difficulty, but early on you only have 3 or 4 hearts, and not any bottles that you can pack away fairies in. It does make it so you actually have to be a little bit more careful in how you do things. But even by the time you're getting to these later game bosses, it really makes no difference whatsoever.
It doesn't matter.
Especially if you have like 4 fairies packed away in bottles, it doesn't change anything effectively. So yeah, that's my one criticism of the game. They could even give these guys a little bit more health, and that would be something. And it's not really changing much, but that's just the one thing that I wish was better, mainly. And
did you might not have, but did you use any of the amiibo?
I actually had not owned any of the amiibos up to this point. When I got the game and get the Wolf Link one because it comes with it, right. That I guess unlocks a challenge dungeon which you can play as the wolf. But I didn't do that because it seems kind of pointless. But
that's what I've heard. And obviously then you can use the Smash Brothers series once, which I have used a little bit of that just to check it out, and it is literally just it refills your hearts, it refills your arrows, or whatever.
I know, like for instance, one of my favorite parts of the game, and a lot of the more recent Zelda games have this anyway, or something similar to this, is the Cave of Ordeals, which is basically like a 50 room combat challenge arena, which it's not really necessarily difficult, but it's still the most difficult part of the game. And you have to be a little bit careful with your items and things as you go in. And I know the Wolf Link amiibo basically is another one of those. Or something. It's similar to that. Only you have to use the Wolf Link form. That just didn't sound that interesting to me. Especially because your reward for that is kind of pointless. It's literally a rupee bag that holds 10,000 rupees or 9,900 whatever. But you never need that. So that's also one thing in the original game is you always get way more rupees than you ever need.
Yeah, hopefully that's one of my hopes for the new game, that maybe they can make money have some meaning.
Improve that economy
I feel like for a
bit.
long time.
I know Skyward Sword added those a couple of like crafting items,
and they had things like shield durability as well. But even so, they still it's money's still largely meaningless. So hopefully that's something they can fix.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean,
just one last thing on the amiibos. I know the Ganondorf one. I'm pretty sure I didn't do this because I don't actually have it, but I'm pretty sure it basically doubles damage taken even on top of hero mode.
Yes.
So if you want the highest level of challenge, you would use that as well. So that's an option. But...
Yeah, that is correct. That's exactly what that does. But yeah, I don't know. It feels like a solid port. For me, I was reminded that perhaps when removed, for me at least, when removed from the excitement of a console launch and the excitement of there not being a Zelda game for such a long time, it isn't quite as good as I remember. But damn, some of that dungeon design is amazing. And some of the weapons and stuff, like little things like, you know, the difference between the normal boomerang and the Gale boomerang in this is significant enough to matter, and it makes the most interesting boomerang in the series.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's just a lot of small things about the game that I like. I guess one thing, like a lot of people, might criticize the pacing. Like, for instance, you have to go through the Lost Woods twice, which is kind of feels like it's padding, which it is padding. You do it once, and then you just gotta have to do the whole thing over again a little bit later. But things like that, it's kind of like, yes, I see it as a problem, but it doesn't really bother me. So it's But there are also things like with the story that I like. I know Zelda games, they're well, at least they haven't been that story focused, although it might be with Skyward Sword maybe more so now. But there's just a couple of characters and scenes, and Midna especially, I think, they add a little bit of that emotional core, I think, that makes that adds a little bit to the narrative that I think really resonates with me. But not too much to be overbearing, I think. Like, I think Skyward Sword, I think there's just a little bit too much in terms of its cutscenes and its dialogue. But yeah,
it's weird because if you were to pull Skyward Sword back a little bit and focus on the bits that really work, focus on what's his name, Bruce, and like I love the spoilers. I love the dynamic of the two different versions of Impa you see and things like that, and then get rid of a lot of the other extraneous stuff. It would be a better game, but unfortunately, it's just so talky. In fact, it made me really nervous because I saw an interview. I think it was a Japanese magazine interview or something like that, or maybe it was Game Informer, with Anuma about Zelda, and he was talking about how he's at the same stretch now in the new game that he was in with Twilight Princess when they started doing press around that, which was that he was editing a lot of the script. And when I read that, I was like, "Oh no, don't be the."
Do you mean Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword?
No, he was saying, like, because it was an interview to promote Twilight Princess, and they asked him about the new game, I think, and he said, "Oh, well, I'm in the same stage for that now that I was in when we first started talking to media about Twilight Princess all those years ago." And he said it was the script stage of tweaking all the writing and all that. So I hope
the new game, starting with A Link Between Worlds, which I know is different enough in itself. They basically seem like they're trying to mix things up with the formula a little bit, and this time, of course, they're going for that whole open world idea, and maybe a little bit less separated into distinct dungeons. We don't really know anything yet, but
I'm very curious as to how that will manifest itself.
I'm kind of imagining Assassin's Creed Zelda, and I don't know what I think about that.
Well, one of the things that had me thinking about Zelda recently, of all things, was the Witness, because in that game, the way that you solve puzzles, and then it has impacts in other areas of the island, but the island is this one relatively small enclosed space, but then it starts to feel huge because it's underground, there's mountains you climb. Reminds me a lot of an old Zelda game, except instead of discrete dungeons although there kind of are discrete dungeons in a weird way in that game. The whole island itself is a puzzle, and I would love a Zelda game where the whole world is a puzzle in a sense.
I think
don't know.
that
I
was
guess we'll
something
see.
they mentioned, like right in one of the earliest interviews. Was trying to have some, and Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword had a tiny, tiny bit of this, but having some of that, how do I put this? They had some of that dungeon design outside of the dungeons, like puzzles and figuring out how to unlock paths and, how to unlock new areas. Almost, I don't want to. I'm going to regret saying this. Almost like Metroid, where it's maybe something that's locked off originally, but you can get to it later when you have some ability or item. So I think that's one thing they said they wanted to do was try to take some of those dungeon elements outside of the dungeons and put them into the world at large. But at this point, it's all just kind of speculation and imagination on what they're going to do with that. So, still supposedly coming out this year.
We will see. I guess we'll hopefully learn more at E3. But I don't know if there's much else to say in terms of Twilight.
It's kind of a known quantity, and the HD version. It improves on, a couple of the more minimal things that are easily improved. But if you weren't really a fan of some of the structural things, of some of the design things, this really it's the same game, so it's not gonna change your mind. But I do think it is the best version of the game, and I think you said that as well, and that's not really. I don't think that's not too questionable. But yeah, it's still Twilight Princess, so. That's what it is.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, you know what you're getting, and you're either gonna love it or you're gonna hate it. I hate the early parts of that game, but then, damn, when it gets going, it is.
I would agree that the second half of the game is better than the first. Like once you don't have to worry about those tiers of light, you can warp everywhere. Like start the Arbiter's Ground, you're basically just going mostly from dungeon to dungeon. And there's a little bit of slowdown near the end, though. But I think the second half of the game is probably a stronger half due to its pacing.
Well, I guess we'll. I guess there's a review on the site, so they can go and read your full verdict. Safe in the knowledge that mine would probably be a little bit harsh, just because I. But then again, the situation would probably be reversed if you went and read my Wind Waker review. And I guess we live in hope about the new game. I've got really high hopes for a Zelda that I can really fall hardcore in love with again. So I'm crossing my fingers there.
Yep. Well, I think that kind of wraps up everything you wanted to say about this. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's really important to mention, but I don't think so. So yeah, thanks everybody for listening and watching.
Yeah, thank you.
You can visit us at rpgsite.net or on Twitter at twitter.com/rpgsite. And we'll see you for the next video.
See you, everyone.